Part 1, Chapter 8
of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 3. To Let by John Galsworthy.
Part 1, Chapter 8 Idyll on Grass. When those two young Forsytes emerged from the Chine Lane and set their faces eastward towards the sun, there was not a cloud in heaven, and the downs were dewy. They had come at a good bat up the slope, and were a little out of breath. If they had anything to say, they did not say it, but marched in the early awkwardness of unbreakfasted morning under the songs of the larks. The stealing out had been fun, but with the freedom of the tops their sense of conspiracy ceased, and gave place to dumbness. "We've made one blooming error," said Fleur, when they had gone half a mile. "I'm hungry." John produced a stick of chocolate. They shared it, and their tongues were loosened. They discussed the nature of their homes and previous existences, which had a kind of fascinating unreality up on this lonely height. There remained but one thing solid in John's past, his mother; but one thing solid in Fleur's, her father; and of these figures, as though seen in the distance with disapproving faces, they spoke little. The down dipped and rose again towards Chanctonbury Ring. A sparkle of far sea came into view. A sparrowhawk hovered in the sun's eye, so that the blood-nourished brown of his wings gleamed nearly red. John had a passion for birds, and an aptitude for sitting very still to watch them, keen-sighted, and with a memory for what interested him. On birds he was almost worth listening to. But in Chanctonbury Ring there were none. Its great beech temple was empty of life and almost chilly at this early hour. They came out willingly again into the sun on the far side. It was Fleur's turn now. She spoke of dogs and the way people treated them. It was wicked to keep them on chains. She would like to flog people who did that. John was astonished to find her so humanitarian. She knew a dog, it seemed, which some farmer near her home kept chained up at the end of his chicken run, in all weathers, till it had almost lost its voice from barking. "And the misery is," she said vehemently, "that if the poor thing didn't bark at every one who passes, it wouldn't be kept there. I do think men are cunning brutes. I've let it go twice on the sly. It's nearly bitten me both times, and then it simply goes mad with joy, but it always runs back home at last, and they chain it up again. If I had my way, I'd chain that man up." John saw her teeth and her eyes gleam. "I'd brand him on his forehead with the word brute. That would teach him." John agreed that it would be a good remedy. "It's their sense of property," he said, "which makes people chain things. The last generation thought of nothing but property.
And that's why there was the war." "Oh," said Fleur, "I'd never thought of that." "Your people and mine quarrelled about property."
And anyway, we've all got it.
"At least, I suppose your people have." "Oh yes, luckily. I don't suppose I should be any good at making money. If you were, I don't believe I should like you." John slipped his hand tremulously under her arm. Fleur looked straight before her and chanted: "John, John, the farmer's son, stole a pig and away he run." John's arm crept round her waist. "This is rather sudden," said Fleur calmly. "Do you often do it?" John dropped his arm, but when she laughed his arm stole back again, and Fleur began to sing: "Oh, who will o'er the downs so free? Oh, who will with me ride? Oh, who will up and follow me?" "Sing, John." John sang. The larks joined in, sheep bells, and an early morning church far away over in Steyning. They went on from tune to tune, till Fleur said: "Oh, my God, I am hungry now." "Oh, I'm sorry." She looked round into his face. "John, you're rather a darling." And she pressed his hand against her waist. John almost reeled from happiness. A yellow and white dog coursing a hare startled them apart. They watched the two vanish down the slope, till Fleur said with a sigh: "He'll never catch it, thank goodness. What's the time? Mine's stopped. I never wound it." John looked at his watch. "By Jove," he said, "mine's stopped too." They walked on again, but only hand in hand. "If the grass is dry," said Fleur, "let's sit down for half a minute." John took off his coat, and they shared it. "Smell actually wild thyme." With his arm round her waist again, they sat some minutes in silence. "We are goats!" cried Fleur, jumping up. "We shall be most fearfully late, and look so silly, and put them on their guard. Look here, John, we only came out to get an appetite for breakfast, and lost our way. See?" "Yes," said John. "It's serious. There'll be a stopper put on us. Are you a good liar?" "I believe not very, but I can try." Fleur frowned. "You know," she said, "I realise that they don't mean us to be friends." "Why not?" "I told you why. But that's silly." "Yes, but you don't know my father." "I suppose he's fearfully fond of you." "You see, I'm an only child, and so are you of your mother. Isn't it a bore? There's so much expected of one. By the time they've done expecting, one's as good as dead." "Yes," muttered John, "life's beastly short. One wants to live for ever, and know everything." "And love everybody?" "No," cried John, "I only want to love once—you." "Indeed, you're coming on. Oh, look, there's the chalk pit. We can't be very far now. Let's run." John followed, wondering fearfully if he had offended her. The chalk pit was full of sunshine and the murmuration of bees. Fleur flung back her hair. "Well," she said, "in case of accident, you may give me one kiss, John." And she pushed her cheek forward. With ecstasy he kissed that hot, soft cheek. "Now remember, we lost our way, and leave it to me as much as you can. I'm going to be rather beastly to you. It's safer. Try and be beastly to me." John shook his head. "That's impossible." "Just to please me, till 5 o'clock at all events." "Anybody will be able to see through it," said John gloomily. "Well, do your best. Look, there they are. Wave your hat. Oh, you haven't got one. Well, I'll cooee. Get a little away from me and look sulky." 5 minutes later, entering the house and doing his utmost to look sulky, John heard her clear voice in the dining room. "Oh, I'm simply ravenous. He's going to be a farmer, and he loses the way. The boy's an idiot." End of Part 1, Chapter 8.
Part 1, Chapter 9 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 9, Goya. Lunch was over, and Soames mounted to the picture gallery in his house near Mapledurham. He had what Annette called a grief. Fleur was not yet home. She had been expected on Wednesday, had wired that it would be Friday, and again on Friday that it would be Sunday afternoon. And here were her aunt and her cousins the Cardigans, and this fellow Profonde, and everything flat as a pancake for the want of her. He stood before his Gauguin, sorest point of his collection. He had bought the ugly great thing with too early Matisse before the war, because there was such a fuss about these post-impressionist chaps. He was wondering whether Profonde would take them off his hands. The fellow seemed not to know what to do with his money. When he heard his sister's voice say, "I think that's a horrid thing, Soames," and saw that Winifred had followed him up. "Oh, you do?" he said dryly. "I gave 500 for it." "Fancy! Women aren't made like that, even if they are black." Soames uttered a glum laugh. "You didn't come up to tell me that?" "No. Do you know that Jolyon's boy is staying with Val and his wife?" Soames spun round. "What?" "Yes," drawled Winifred. "He's gone to live with them while he learns farming." Soames had turned away, but her voice pursued him as he walked up and down. "I warned Val that neither of them was to be spoken to about old matters." Why didn't you tell me before?" Winifred shrugged her substantial shoulders. "Fleur does what she likes. You've always spoiled her. Besides, my dear boy, what's the harm?" "The harm!" muttered Soames. "Why, she—" He checked himself. The Juno, the handkerchief, Fleur's eyes, her questions, and now this delay in her return. The symptoms seemed to him so sinister that, faithful to his nature, he could not part with them. "I think you take too much care," said Winifred. "If I were you, I should tell her of that old matter. It's no good thinking that girls in these days are as they used to be. Where they pick up their knowledge I can't tell, but they seem to know everything." Over Soames's face, closely composed, passed a sort of spasm, and Winifred added hastily, "If you don't like to speak of it, I could for you." Soames shook his head. Unless there was absolute necessity, the thought that his adored daughter should learn of that old scandal hurt his pride too much. "No," he said, "not yet. Never, if I can help it." "Nonsense, my dear. Think what people are." 20 years is a long time," muttered Soames. "Outside our family, who's likely to remember?" Winifred was silenced. She inclined more and more to that peace and quietness of which Montague Dartie had deprived her in her youth, and, since pictures always depressed her, she soon went down again. Soames passed into the corner, where, side by side, hung his real Goya and the copy of the fresco La Vendimia. His acquisition of the real Goya rather beautifully illustrated the cobweb of vested interests and passions which mesh the bright-winged fly of human life. The real Goya's noble owner's ancestor had come into possession of it during some Spanish war. It was, in a word, loot. The noble owner had remained in ignorance of its value until in the 90s an enterprising critic discovered that a Spanish painter named Goya was a genius. It was only a fair Goya, but almost unique in England, and the noble owner became a marked man. Having many possessions and that aristocratic culture which, independent of mere sensuous enjoyment, is founded on the sounder principle that one must know everything and be fearfully interested in life, he had fully intended to keep an article which contributed to his reputation while he was alive, and to leave it to the nation after he was dead. Fortunately for Soames, the House of Lords was violently attacked in 1909, and the noble owner became alarmed and angry. "If," he said to himself, "they think they can have it both ways, they are very much mistaken. So long as they leave me in quiet enjoyment, the nation can have some of my pictures at my death. But if the nation is going to bait me, and rob me like this, I'm damned if I won't sell the lot. They can't have my private property and my public spirit both." He brooded in this fashion for several months, till one morning, after reading the speech of a certain statesman, he telegraphed to his agent to come down and bring Bodkin. On going over the collection, Bodkin, than whose opinion on market values none was more sought, pronounced that with a free hand to sell to America, Germany, and other places where there was an interest in art, a lot more money could be made than by selling in England. The noble owner's public spirit, he said, was well known, but the pictures were unique. The noble owner put this opinion in his pipe, and smoked it for a year. At the end of that time he read another speech by the same statesman, and telegraphed to his agents, "Give Bodkin a free hand." It was at this juncture that Bodkin conceived the idea which salved the Goya and 2 other unique pictures for the native country of the noble owner. With one hand Bodkin proffered the pictures to the foreign market, with the other he formed a list of private British collectors. Having obtained what he considered the highest possible bids from across the seas, he submitted pictures and bids to the private British collectors, and invited them, of their public spirit, to outbid. In 3 instances, including the Goya, out of 21, he was successful. And why? One of the private collectors made buttons. He made so many that he desired that his wife should be called Lady Buttons. He therefore bought a unique picture at great cost, and gave it to the nation. It was part, his friend said, of his general game. The second of the private collector was an Americaphobe, and bought a unique picture to spite the damned Yanks. The third of the private collectors was Soames, who, more sober than either of the others, bought after a visit to Madrid because he was certain that Goya was still on the upgrade. Goya was not booming at the moment, but he would come again, and looking at that portrait, Hogarthian, Manetesque in its directness, but with its own queer, sharp beauty of paint, he was perfectly satisfied still that he had made no error, heavy though the price had been, heaviest he had ever paid. And next to it was hanging the copy of La Vendimia. There she was, the little wretch, looking back at him in her dreamy mood, the mood he loved best because he felt so much safer when she looked like that. He was still gazing when the scent of a cigar impinged on his nostrils, and a voice said, "Well, Mr. Forsyte, what you going to do with this small lot?" That Belgian chap, whose mother, as if Flemish blood were not enough, had been Armenian. Subduing a natural irritation, he said, "Are you a judge of pictures?" "Well, I've got a few myself." "Any post-impressionists?" "Yes, I rather like them." "What do you think of this?" said Soames, pointing to the Gauguin. Monsieur Profond protruded his lower lip and short pointed beard. "Rather fine, I think," he said. "Do you want to sell it?" Soames checked his instinctive "not particularly." He would not chaffer with this alien. "Yes," he said. "What do you want for it?" "What I gave." "All right," said Monsieur Profond. "I'll be glad to take that small picture. Post-impressionists, they're awful dead, but they're amusing. I don't care for pictures much, but I've got some, just a small lot." "What do you care for?" Monsieur Profond shrugged his shoulders. "Life's awful like a lot of monkeys scrambling for empty nuts." "You're young," said Soames. If the fellow must make a generalization, he needn't suggest that the forms of property lacked solidity. "I don't worry," replied Monsieur Profond, smiling. "We're born and we die. Half the world's starving. I feed a small lot of babies out in my mother's country, but what's the use? Might as well throw my money in the river." Soames looked at him and turned back towards his Goya. He didn't know what the fellow wanted. "What shall I make my cheque for?" pursued Monsieur Profond. 500, said Soames shortly. "But I don't want you to take it if you don't care for it more than that." "Oh, that's all right," said Monsieur Profond. "I'll be happy to have that picture." He wrote a cheque with a fountain pen heavily chased with gold. Soames watched the process uneasily. How on earth had the fellow known that he wanted to sell that picture? Monsieur Profond held out the cheque. "The English are awfully funny about pictures," he said. "So are the French. So are my people. They're all awful funny." "I don't understand you," said Soames stiffly. "It's like hats," said Monsieur Profond enigmatically. "Small or large, turning up or down, just the fashion. Awful funny." And smiling, he drifted out of the gallery again, blue and solid, like the smoke of his excellent cigar. Soames had taken the cheque, feeling as if the intrinsic value of ownership had been called in question. "He's a cosmopolitan," he thought, watching Profond emerge from under the veranda with Annette, and saunter down the lawn towards the river. What his wife saw in the fellow he didn't know, unless it was that he could speak her language, and there passed in Soames what Monsieur Profond would have called a small doubt whether Annette was not too handsome to be walking with anyone so cosmopolitan. Even at that distance he could see the blue fumes from Profond's cigar wreath out in the quiet sunlight, and his grey buckskin shoes, and his grey hat. The fellow was a dandy. And he could see the quick turn of his wife's head so very straight on her desirable neck and shoulders. That turn of her neck always seemed to him a little too showy, and in the "Queen of all I survey" manner, not quite distinguished. He watched them walk along the path at the bottom of the garden. A young man in flannels joined them down there, a Sunday caller no doubt from up the river. He went back to his Goya. He was still staring at that replica of Fleur and worrying over Winifred's news, when his wife's voice said, "Mr. Michael Mont, Soames, you invited him to see your pictures." There was the cheerful young man at the gallery off Cork Street. "Turned up, you see, sir. I live only 4 miles from Pangbourne. Jolly day, isn't it?" Confronted with the results of his expansiveness, Soames scrutinized his visitor. The young man's mouth was excessively large and curly. He seemed always grinning. Why didn't he grow the rest of those idiotic little moustaches which made him look like a music-hall buffoon? What on earth were young men about, deliberately lowering their class with these toothbrushes or little slug whiskers? Ugh! Affected young idiots! In other respects he was presentable, and his flannels very clean. "Happy to see you," he said. The young man, who had been turning his head from side to side, became transfixed. "I say," he said, "some picture." Soames saw with mixed sensations that he had addressed the remark to the Goya copy. "Yes," he said dryly, "that's not a Goya, it's a copy. I had it painted because it reminded me of my daughter." "By Jove, I thought I knew the face, sir. Is she here?" The frankness of his interest almost disarmed Soames. "She'll be in after tea," he said. "Shall we go round the pictures?" And Soames began that round which never tired him. He had not anticipated much intelligence from one who had mistaken a copy for an original, but as they passed from section to section, period to period, he was startled by the young man's frank and relevant remarks. Natively shrewd himself, and even sensuous beneath his mask, Soames had not spent 38 years over his one hobby without knowing something more about pictures than their market values. He was, as it were, the missing link between the artist and the commercial public. Art for art's sake and all that, of course, was cant. But aesthetics and good taste were necessary. The appreciation of enough persons of good taste was what gave a work of art its permanent market value, or in other words made it a work of art. There was no real cleavage, and he was sufficiently accustomed to sheep-like and unseeing visitors to be intrigued by one who did not hesitate to say of Mauve, "Good old haystacks," or of James Marius, "Didn't you just paint and paper 'em? Matthew was the real swell, sir. You could dig into his services." It was after the young man had whistled before a whistler, with the words, "Do you think he ever really saw a naked woman, sir?" that Soames remarked, "What are you, Mr. Mont, if I may ask?" "I, sir? I was going to be a painter, but the war knocked that. Then in the trenches, you know, I used to dream of the Stock Exchange, snug and warm and just noisy enough. But the peace knocked that. Shares seem off, don't they? I've only been demobbed about a year. What do you recommend, sir?" "Have you got money?" "Well," answered the young man, "I've got a father. I kept him alive during the war, so he's bound to keep me alive now. Though, of course, there's the question whether he ought to be allowed to hang on to his property. What do you think about that, sir?" Soames, pale and defensive, smiled. "The old man has fits when I tell him he may have to yet work. He's got land, you know. It's a fatal disease." "This is my real Goya," said Soames dryly. "By George, he was a swell. I saw a Goya in Munich once that bowled me middle stump. Most evil-looking old woman in the most gorgeous lace. He made no compromise with the public taste. That old boy was some explosive. He must have smashed up a lot of convention in his day. Couldn't he just paint? He makes Velasquez stiff, don't you think?" "I have no Velasquez," said Soames. The young man stared. "No," he said, "only nations or profiteers can afford him, I suppose. I say, why shouldn't all the bankrupt nations sell their Velasquez, Titians, and other swells to the profiteers by force, and then pass a law that anyone who holds a picture by an old master, see schedule, Must hang it in a public gallery. There seems something in that. Shall we go down to tea? Said Soames. The young man's ears seemed to droop on his skull. He's not dense, thought Soames, following him off the premises. Goya, with his satiric and surpassing precision, his original line, and the daring of his light and shade, could have reproduced to aberration the group assembled round Annette's tea-tray in the ingle-nook below. He alone, perhaps, of painters would have done justice to the sunlight filtering through a screen of creeper, to the lovely pallor of brass, the old cut glasses, the thin slices of lemon in pale amber tea. Justice to Annette in her black lacy dress. There was something of the fair Spaniard in her beauty, though it lacked the spirituality of that rare type. To Winifred's grey-haired, corseted solidity. To Soames of a certain grey and flat-cheeked distinction, to the vivacious Michael Mont, pointed in ear and eye. To Imogen, dark, luscious of glance, growing a little stout. To Prosper Profond, with his expressionist who would say, "Well, Mr. Goya, what's the use of paint in this small party?" Finally, to Jack Cardigan, with his shining stare and tanned sanguinity, betraying the moving principle, "I'm English, and I live to be fit." Curious, by the way, that Imogen, who as a girl had declared solemnly one day at Timothy's that she would never marry a good man, they were so dull, should have married Jack Cardigan, in whom health had so destroyed all traces of original sin that she might have retired to rest with 10,000 other Englishmen without knowing the difference from the one she had chosen to repose beside. "Oh," she would say of him, in her amusing way, "Jack keeps himself so fearfully fit, he's never had a day's illness in his life. He went right through the war without a finger-ache. You really can't imagine how fit he is." Indeed, he was so fit that he couldn't see when she was flirting, which was such a comfort in a way. All the same, she was quite fond of him, so far as one could be of a sports machine, and of the two little cardigans made after his pattern. Her eyes just then were comparing him maliciously with Prosper Profond. There was no small sport or game which Monsieur Profond had not played at too, it seemed, from skittles to tarpon fishing, and worn out every one. Imogen would sometimes wish that they had worn out Jack, who continued to play at them and talk of them with the simple zeal of a schoolgirl learning hockey. At the age of great-uncle Timothy she well knew that Jack would be playing carpet golf in her bedroom and wiping somebody's eye. He was telling them now how he had pipped the pro, a charming fellow playing a very good game, at the last hole this morning, and how he had pulled down to Caversham since lunch, and trying to incite Prosper Profond to play him a set of tennis after tea. "Do him good, keep him fit." "But what's the use of keeping fit?" said Monsieur Profond. "Yes, sir," murmured Michael Mont. "What do you keep fit for?" "Jack," cried Imogen, enchanted, "what do you keep fit for?" Jack Cardigan stared with all his health. The questions were like the buzz of a mosquito, and he put up his hand to wipe them away. During the war, of course, he had kept fit to kill Germans. Now that it was over, he either did not know or shrank in delicacy from explanation of his moving principle. "But he's right," said Monsieur Profond unexpectedly. "There's nothing left but keeping fit." The saying, too deep for Sunday afternoon, would have passed unanswered, but for the mercurial nature of young Mont. "Good!" he cried. "That's the great discovery of the war. We all thought we were progressing. Now we know we're only changing." "For the worse," said Monsieur Profond genially. "Ah, you are cheerful, Prosper," murmured Annette. "You come and play tennis," said Jack Cardigan. "You've got the hump. We'll soon take that down. Do you play, Mr. Mont?" "I hit the ball about, sir." At this junction Soames rose, ruffled in that deep instinct of preparation for the future which guided his existence. "When Fleur comes," he heard Jack Cardigan say. Ugh! And why didn't she come? He passed through drawing-room, hall and porch out onto the drive, and stood there, listening for the car. All was still and Sunday-fied. The lilacs in full flower scented the air. There were white clouds, like the feathers of ducks gilded by the sunlight. Memory of the day when Fleur was born, and he had waited in such agony with her life and her mother's balanced in his hands, came to him sharply. He had saved her then, to be the flower of his life, and now was she going to give him trouble, pain, give him trouble? He did not like the look of things. A blackbird broke in on his reverie with an evening song, a great big fellow up in that acacia tree. Soames had taken quite an interest in his birds of late years. He and Fleur would walk round and watch them. Her eyes were sharp as needles, and she knew every nest. He saw her dog, a retriever, lying on the drive in a patch of sunlight, and called to him, "Hello, old fellow! Waiting for her too?" The dog came slowly with a grudging tail, and Soames mechanically laid a pat on its head. The dog, the bird, the lilac, all were part of Fleur for him, no more, no less. Too fond of her, he thought, too fond. He was like a man uninsured with his ships at sea, uninsured again, as if in that other time so long ago, when he would wander dumb and jealous in the wilderness of London, longing for that woman, his first wife, the mother of this infernal boy. Ah! There was the car at last. It drew up. It had luggage. But no Fleur. "Miss Fleur is walking up, sir, by the towing path." Walking all those miles? Soames stared. The man's face had the beginning of a smile on it. What was he grinning at? And very quickly he turned, saying, "All right, Sims," and went into the house. He mounted to the picture gallery once more. He had from there a view of the river bank, and stood with his eyes fixed on it, oblivious of the fact that it would be an hour at least before her figure showed there. Walking up? And that fellow's grin! The boy! He turned abruptly from the window. He couldn't spy on her. If she wanted to keep things from him, she must. He could not spy on her. His heart felt empty, and bitterness mounted from it into his very mouth. The staccato shouts of Jack Cardigan pursuing the ball, the laugh of young Mont rose in the stillness and came in. He hoped they were making that chap Profond run. And the girl in La Vendimia stood with her arm akimbo and her dreamy eyes looking past him. "I've done all I could for you," he thought, "since you were no higher than my knee. You aren't going to hurt me, are you?" But the Goya copy answered not, brilliant in colour, just beginning to tone down. "There's no real life in it," thought Soames. "Why doesn't she come?" End of Part 1, Chapter 9. Recording by Simon Evers.
Part 1, Chapter 10 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 3. To Let by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 10 Trio. Among those four Forsytes of the third and, as one might say, fourth generation, at Wansdon under the Downs, a week-end prolonged into the 9th day had stretched the crossing threads of tenacity almost to snapping point. Never had Fleur been so fine, Holly so watchful, Val so stable secretive, John so silent and disturbed. What he learnt of farming in that week might have been balanced on the point of a penknife and puffed off. He, whose nature was essentially averse from intrigue, and whose adoration of Fleur disposed him to think that any need for concealing it was skittles, chafed and fretted, yet obeyed, taking what relief he could in the few moments when they were alone. On Thursday, while they were standing in the bay window of the drawing-room, dressed for dinner, she said to him: "John, I'm going home on Sunday by the 3:40 from Paddington. If you were to go home on Saturday, you could come up on Sunday and take me down, and just get back here by the last train after. You were going home anyway, weren't you?" John nodded. "Anything to be with you," he said. "Only, why need I pretend?" Fleur slipped her little finger into his palm. "You have no instinct, John. You must leave things to me. It's serious about our people. We've simply got to be secret at present if we want to be together." The door was opened, and she added loudly: "You are a duffer, John." Something turned over within John. He could not bear this subterfuge about a feeling so natural, so overwhelming, and so sweet. On Friday night about 11 he had packed his bag, and was leaning out of his window, half miserable and half lost in a dream of Paddington Station, when he heard a tiny sound, as of a finger–nail tapping on his door. He rushed to it and listened. Again the sound. It was a nail. He opened. Oh, what a lovely thing came in! "I wanted to show you my fancy dress," it said, and struck an attitude at the foot of his bed. John drew a long breath and leant against the door. The apparition wore white muslin on its head, a fichu round its bare neck over a wine-coloured dress, fulled out below its slender waist. It held one arm akimbo, and the other raised, right-angled, holding a fan which touched its head. "This ought to be a basket of grapes," it whispered, "but I haven't got it here. It's my Goya dress, and this is the attitude in the picture. Do you like it?" "It's a dream." The apparition pirouetted. "Touch it and see." John knelt down and took the skirt reverently. "Grape colour," came the whisper. "All grapes. La Vendimia." The vintage. John's fingers scarcely touched each side of the waist. He looked up with adoring eyes. "Oh, John!" it whispered, bent, kissed his forehead, pirouetted again, and gliding out was gone. John stayed on his knees, and his head fell forward against the bed. How long he stayed like that he did not know. The little noises of the tapping nail, the feet, the skirts rustling as in a dream, went on about him, and before his closed eyes the figure stood and smiled and whispered, a faint perfume of narcissus lingering in the air. And his forehead, where it had been kissed, had a little cool place between the brows, like the imprint of a flower. Love filled his soul, that love of boy for girl, which knows so little, hopes so much, would not brush the down off for the world, and must become in time a fragrant memory, a searing passion, a humdrum mateship, or once, in many times, vintage full and sweet, with sunset colour on the grapes. Enough has been said about John Forsyte, here and in another place, to show what long marches lay between him and his great-great-grandfather, the first Jolyon, in Dorset down by the sea. John was sensitive as a girl, more sensitive than 9 out of 10 girls of the day, imaginative as one of his half-sister June's lame duck painters, affectionate as a son of his father and mother naturally would be. And yet in his inner tissue there was something of the old founder of his family, a secret tenacity of soul, a dread of showing his feelings, a determination not to know when he was beaten. Sensitive, imaginative, affectionate boys get a bad time at school. But John had instinctively kept his nature dark, and been but normally unhappy there. Only with his mother had he, up till then, been absolutely frank and natural. And when he went home to Robin Hill that Saturday, his heart was heavy, because Fleur had said that he must not be frank and natural with her from whom he had never yet kept anything, must not even tell her that they had met again, unless he found that she knew already. So intolerable did this seem to him that he was very near to telegraphing an excuse and staying up in London. And the first thing his mother said to him was: "So you've had our little friend of the confectioner's there, John? What is she like on second thoughts?" With relief and a high colour, John answered: "Oh, awfully jolly, Mum." Her arm pressed his. John had never loved her so much as in that minute, which seemed to falsify Fleur's fears and to release his soul. He turned to look at her, but something in her smiling face, something which only he perhaps would have caught, stopped the words bubbling up in him. Could fear go with a smile? If so, there was fear in her face. And out of John tumbled quite other words, about farming, Holly, and the Downs. Talking fast, he waited for her to come back to Fleur, but she did not. Nor did his father mention her, though of course he too must have known. What deprivation and killing of reality was in his silence about Fleur, when he was so full of her, when his mother was so full of John and his father so full of his mother. And so the trio spent the evening of that Saturday. After dinner his mother played. She seemed to play all the things he liked best, and he sat with one knee clasped and his hair standing up where his fingers had run through it. He gazed at his mother while she played, but he saw Fleur. Fleur in the moonlit orchard, Fleur in the sunlit gravel pit, Fleur in that fancy dress, swaying, whispering, stooping, kissing his forehead. Once, while he listened, he forgot himself and glanced at his father in that other easy chair. What was Dad looking like that for? The expression on his face was so sad and puzzling. It filled him with a sort of remorse, so that he got up and went and sat on the arm of his father's chair. From there he could not see his face, and again he saw Fleur, in his mother's hands, slim and white on the keys, in the profile of her face and her powdery hair, and down the long room in the open window where the May night walked outside. When he went up to bed, his mother came into his room. She stood at the window and said: "Those cypresses your grandfather planted down there have done wonderfully. I always think they look beautiful under a dropping moon. I wish you had known your grandfather, John." "Were you married to Father when he was alive?" asked John suddenly. "No, dear, he died in '92, very old. 85, I think." "Is Father like him?" "A little, but more subtle, and not quite so solid." "I know, from grandfather's portrait. Who painted that?" "One of June's lame ducks, but it's quite good." John slipped his hand through his mother's arm. "Tell me about the family quarrel, Mum." He felt her arm quivering. "No, dear, that's for your father some day, if he thinks fit." "Then it was serious," said John, with a catch in his breath. "Yes." And there was a silence, during which neither knew whether the arm or the hand within it were quivering most. "Some people," said Irene softly, "think the moon on her back is evil. To me she's always lovely. Look at those cypress shadows, John. Father says we may go to Italy, you and I, for 2 months. Would you like?" John took his hand from under her arm. His sensation was so sharp and so confused. Italy with his mother! A fortnight ago it would have been perfection. Now it filled him with dismay. He felt that the sudden suggestion had to do with Fleur. He stammered out: "Oh, yes, only I don't know. Now I've just begun, I'd like to think it over." Her voice answered, cool and gentle: "Yes, dear, think it over. But better now than when you've begun farming seriously. Italy with you, it would be nice." John put his arm round her waist, still slim and firm as a girl's. "Do you think you ought to leave Father?" he said feebly, feeling very mean. "Father suggested it. He thinks you ought to see Italy, at least before you settle down to anything." The sense of meanness died in John. He knew, yes, he knew that his father and his mother were not speaking frankly, no more than he himself. They wanted to keep him from Fleur. His heart hardened, and, as if she felt that process going on, his mother said: "Good night, darling. Have a good sleep and think it over. But it would be lovely." She pressed him to her so quickly that he did not see her face. John stood feeling exactly as he used to when he was a naughty little boy. Sore because he was not loving, and because he was justified in his own eyes. "But Irene, after she had stood a moment in her own room, passed through the dressing-room between it and her husband's. "Well?" "He will think it over, Jolyon." Watching her lips, that wore a little drawn smile, Jolyon said quietly: "You had better let me tell him, and have done with it. After all, John has the instincts of a gentleman. He has only to understand." "Only he can't understand. That's impossible." "I believe I could, at his age." Irene caught his hand. "You were always more of a realist than John, and never so innocent." "That's true," said Jolyon. "It's queer, isn't it? You and I would tell our stories to the world without a particle of shame, but our own boy stumps us. We've never cared whether the world approves or not. John would not disapprove of us." "Oh, Jolyon, yes, he's in love. I feel he's in love. And he'd say, 'My mother once married without love. How could she have?' It'll seem to him a crime. And so it was." Jolyon took her hand and said with a wry smile: "Ah, why on earth are we born young? Now, if only we were born old and grew younger year by year, we should understand how things happen, and drop all our cursed intolerance. But you know, if the boy is really in love, he won't forget, even if he goes to Italy. We're a tenacious breed, and he'll know by instinct why he's being sent. Nothing will really cure him but the shock of being told." "Let me try, anyway." Jolyon stood a moment without speaking. Between this devil and this deep sea, the pain of a dreaded disclosure, and the grief of losing his wife for 2 months, he secretly hoped for the devil. Yet, if she wished for the deep sea, he must put up with it. After all, it would be training for that departure from which there would be no return. And, taking her in his arms, he kissed her eyes and said: "As you will, my love." End of Part 1, Chapter 10.
Part 1, Chapter 11 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 11, Duet. That small emotion, love, grows amazingly when threatened with extinction. John reached Paddington Station half an hour before his time, and a full week after, as it seemed to him. He stood at the appointed bookstall, amid a crowd of Sunday travellers, in a Harris tweed suit, exhaling, as it were, the emotion of his thumping heart. He read the names of the novels on the bookstall, and bought one at last, to avoid being regarded with suspicion by the bookstall clerk. It was called The Heart of the Trail, which must mean something, though it did not seem to. He also bought The Lady's Mirror and The Landsman. Every minute was an hour long, and full of horrid imaginings. After 19 had passed, he saw her with a bag and a porter wheeling her luggage. She came swiftly, she came cool. She greeted him as if he were a brother. "First class," she said to the porter. "Corner seats, opposite." John admired her frightful self-possession. "Can't we get a carriage to ourselves?" he whispered. "No good. It's a stopping train. After Maidenhead, perhaps. Look natural, John." John screwed his features into a scowl. They got in, with 2 other beasts, oh heaven! He tipped the porter unnaturally, in his confusion. The brute deserved nothing for putting him in there, and looking as if he knew all about it into the bargain. Fleur hid herself behind The Lady's Mirror. John imitated her behind The Landsman. The train started. Fleur let The Lady's Mirror fall and leaned forward. "Well?" she said. "It seemed about 15 days." She nodded, and John's face lighted up at once. "Look natural," murmured Fleur, and went off into a bubble of laughter. It hurt him. How could he look natural with Italy hanging over him? He had meant to break it to her gently, but now he blurted it out. "They want me to go to Italy with Mother for 2 months." Fleur drooped her eyelids, turned a little pale, and bit her lips. "Oh!" she said. It was all, but it was much. That "oh" was like the quick drawback of the wrist in fencing ready for riposte. It came. "You must go." "Go?" said John in a strangled voice. "Of course." "But 2 months! It's ghastly." "No," said Fleur, "6 weeks. You'll have forgotten me by then. We'll meet in the National Gallery the day after you get back." John laughed. "But suppose you've forgotten me," he muttered into the noise of the train. Fleur shook her head. "Some other beast," murmured John. Her foot touched his. "No other beast," she said, lifting "The Lady's Mirror." The train stopped. 2 passengers got out, and 1 got in. "I shall die," thought John, "if we're not alone at all." The train went on, and again Fleur leaned forward. "I never let go," she said. "Do you?" John shook his head vehemently. "Never," he said. "Will you write to me?" "No, but you can, to my club." She had a club; she was wonderful. "Did you pump Holly?" he muttered. "Yes, but I got nothing. I didn't dare pump hard." "What can it be?" cried John. "I shall find out all right." A long silence followed, till Fleur said: "This is Maidenhead. Stand by, John." The train stopped. The remaining passenger got out. Fleur drew down her blind. "Quick!" she cried. "Hang out! Look as much of a beast as you can." John blew his nose and scowled. Never in all his life had he scowled like that. An old lady recoiled. A young one tried the handle. It turned, but the door would not open. The train moved. The young lady darted to another carriage. "What luck!" cried John. "It jammed." "Yes," said Fleur, "I was holding it." The train moved out, and John fell on his knees. "Look out for the corridor," she whispered, "and quick." Her lips met his, and though their kiss only lasted perhaps 10 seconds, John's soul left his body and went so far beyond that when he was again sitting opposite that demure figure he was pale as death. He heard her sigh, and the sound seemed to him the most precious he had ever heard, an exquisite declaration that he meant something to her. "6 weeks isn't really long," she said, "and you can easily make it 6 if you keep your head out there and never seem to think of me." John gasped. "This is just what's really wanted, John, to convince them, don't you see? If we're just as bad when you come back they'll stop being ridiculous about it. Only I'm sorry it's not Spain. There's a girl in a Goya picture at Madrid who's like me, father says. Only she isn't. We've got a copy of her." It was to John like a ray of sunshine piercing through a fog. "I'll make it Spain," he said. "Mother won't mind, she's never been there. And my father thinks a lot of Goya." "Oh! Yes, he's a painter, isn't he?" "Only water-colour," said John with honesty. "When we come to Reading, John, get out first and go down to Caversham Lock and wait for me. I'll send the car home and we'll walk by the towing path." John seized her hand in gratitude, and they sat silent, with the world well lost, and one eye on the corridor. But the train seemed to run twice as fast now, and its sound was almost lost in that of John's sighing. "We're getting nearer," said Fleur. "The towing path's awfully exposed. One more. Oh, John, don't forget me." John answered with his kiss. And very soon a flushed, distracted-looking youth could have been seen, as they say, leaping from the train and hurrying along the platform, searching his pockets for his ticket. When at last she rejoined him on the towing path a little beyond Caversham Lock, he had made an effort, and regained some measure of equanimity. If they had to part, he would not make a scene. A breeze by the bright river threw the white side of the willow leaves up into the sunlight, and followed those two with its faint rustle. "I told our chauffeur that I was train-giddy," said Fleur. "Did you look pretty natural as you went out?" "I don't know. What is natural?" "It's natural to you to look seriously happy. When I first saw you I thought you weren't a bit like other people." "Exactly what I thought when I saw you. I knew at once I should never love anybody else." Fleur laughed. "We're absurdly young, and love's young dream is out of date, John. Besides, it's awfully wasteful. Think of all the fun you might have. You haven't begun even. It's a shame, really. And there's me. I wonder—" Confusion came on John's spirit. How could she say such things just as they were going to part? "If you feel like that," he said, "I can't go. I shall tell Mother that I ought to try and work. There's always the condition of the world." "The condition of the world?" John thrust his hands deep into his pockets. "But there is," he said. "Think of the people starving." Fleur shook her head. "No, no, I never, never will make myself miserable for nothing." "Nothing? But there's an awful state of things, and of course one ought to help." "Oh, yes, I know all that. But you can't help people, John. They're hopeless. When you pull them out they only get into another hole. Look at them, still fighting and plotting and struggling, though they're dying in heaps all the time. Idiots." "Aren't you sorry for them?" "Oh, sorry, yes, but I'm not going to make myself unhappy about it. That's no good." And they were silent, disturbed by this first glimpse of each other's natures. "I think people are brutes and idiots," said Fleur stubbornly. "I think they're poor wretches," said John. It was as if they had quarrelled, and at this supreme and awful moment, with parting visible out there in that last gap of the willows. "Well, go and help your poor wretches, and don't think of me." John stood still. Sweat broke out on his forehead, and his limbs trembled. Fleur, too, had stopped, and was frowning at the river. "I must believe in things," said John, with a sort of agony. "We're all meant to enjoy life." Fleur laughed. "Yes, and that's what you won't do if you don't take care. But perhaps your idea of enjoyment is to make yourself wretched. There are lots of people like that, of course." She was pale, her eyes had darkened, her lips had thinned. Was it Fleur thus staring at the water? John had an unreal feeling, as if he were passing through the scene in a book where the lover has to choose between love and duty. But just then she looked round at him. Never was anything so intoxicating as that vivacious look. It acted on him exactly as the tug of a chain acts on a dog. Brought him up to her with his tail wagging and his tongue out. "Don't let's be silly," she said. "Time's too short. Look, John, you can just see where I've got to cross the river. There, round the bend, where the woods begin." John saw a gable, a chimney or two, a patch of wall through the trees, and felt his heart sink. "I mustn't dawdle any more. It's no good going beyond the next hedge. It gets all open. Let's get on to it and say good-bye." They went side by side, hand in hand, silently toward the hedge, where the mayflower, both pink and white, was in full bloom. "My club's the Talisman, Stratton Street, Piccadilly. Letters there will be quite safe, and I'm almost always up once a week." John nodded. His face had become extremely set, his eyes stared straight before him. "To-day's the 23rd of May," said Fleur. "On the 9th of July I shall be in front of the Bacchus and Ariadne at 3 o'clock. Will you?" "I will." "If you feel as bad as I, it's all right. Let those people pass." A man and woman airing their children went by strung out in Sunday fashion. The last of them passed the wicket gate. "Domesticity," said Fleur, and blotted herself against the hawthorn hedge. The blossom sprayed out above her head, and one pink cluster brushed her cheek. John put up his hand, jealously, to keep it off. "Good-bye, John." For a second they stood with hands hard clasped. Then their lips met for the third time, and when they parted, Fleur broke away and fled through the wicket gate. John stood where she had left him, with his forehead against that pink cluster. Gone. For an eternity. For 7 weeks, all but 2 days. And here he was, wasting the last sight of her. He rushed to the gate. She was walking swiftly on the heels of the straggling children. She turned her head. He saw her hand make a little flitting gesture. Then she sped on, and the trailing family blotted her out from his view. The words of a comic song. Paddington groan, worst ever known, he gave a sepulchral Paddington groan, came into his head, and he sped incontinently back to Reading Station. All the way up to London and down to Wansdon he sat with The Heart of the Trail open on his knee, knitting in his head a poem so full of feeling that it would not rhyme. End of Part 1, Chapter 11. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Chapter 12 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 12, Caprice. Fleur sped on. She had need of rapid motion. She was late, and wanted all her wits about her when she got in. She passed the islands, the station and hotel, and was about to take the ferry, when she saw a skiff with a young man standing up in it and holding to the bushes. "Miss Forsyte," he said, "let me put you across. I've come on purpose." She looked at him in blank amazement. "It's all right. I've been having tea with your people. I thought I'd save you the last bit. It's on my way. I'm just off back to Pangbourne. My name's Mont. I saw you at the picture gallery, you remember, when your father invited me to see his pictures." "Oh," said Fleur. "Yes, the handkerchief." To this young man she owed John, and, taking his hand, she stepped down into the skiff. Still emotional and a little out of breath, she sat silent. Not so the young man. She had never heard anyone say so much in so short a time. He told her his age, 24, his weight, 10 stone 11, his place of residence, not far away, described his sensations under fire, and what it felt like to be gassed, criticized the Juno, mentioned his own conception of that goddess, commented on the Goya copy, said Fleur was not too awfully like it, sketched in rapidly the condition of England, spoke of Monsieur Profond, or whatever his name was, as an "awful sport," thought her father had some ripping pictures and some rather dug up, hoped he might row down again and take her on the river because he was quite trustworthy, inquired her opinion of Chekhov, gave her his own, wished they could go to the Russian ballet together some time, considered the name Fleur Forsyte simply topping, cursed his people for giving him the name of Michael on the top of Mont, outlined his father, and said that if she wanted a good book she should read Job. His father was rather like Job, while Job still had land. "But Job didn't have land," Fleur murmured. "He only had flocks and herds, and moved on." "Ah," answered Michael Mont, "I wish my governor would move on. Not that I want his land. Land's an awful bore in these days, don't you think?" "We never have it in my family," said Fleur. "We have everything else. I believe one of my great-uncles once had a sentimental farm in Dorset, because we came from there originally, but it cost him more than it made him happy." "Did he sell it?" "No, he kept it." "Why?" "Because nobody would buy it." "Good for the old boy." "No, it wasn't good for him. Father says it soured him. His name was Swithin." "What a corking name!" "Do you know that we're getting farther off, not nearer? This river flows." "Splendid!" cried Mont, dipping his sculls vaguely. "It's good to meet a girl who's got wit." "But better to meet a young man who's got it in the plural." Young Mont raised a hand to tear his hair. "Look out!" cried Fleur. "Your skull!" "All right. It's thick enough to bear a scratch." "Do you mind sculling?" said Fleur severely. "I want to get in." "Ah," said Mont, "but when you get in, you see, I shan't see you any more to-day. Finis, as the French girl said when she jumped on her bed after saying her prayers. Don't you bless the day that gave you a French mother and a name like yours?" "I like my name, but father gave it to me. Mother wanted me called Marguerite." "Which is absurd. Do you mind calling me M.M. and letting me call you F.F.? It's in the spirit of the age." "I don't mind anything, so long as I get in." Mont caught a little crab and answered, "That was a nasty one." "Please row." "I am." And he did for several strokes, looking at her with rueful eagerness. "Of course you know," he ejaculated, pausing, "that I came to see you, not your father's pictures." Fleur rose. "If you don't row, I shall get out and swim." "Really and truly? Then I could come in after you." "Mr. Mont, I'm late and tired. Please put me on shore at once." When she stepped out onto the garden landing stage he rose, and grasping his hair with both hands, looked at her. Fleur smiled. "Don't!" cried the irrepressible Mont. "I know you're going to say, 'Out, damned hair!'" Fleur whisked round, threw him a wave of her hand. "Good-bye, Mr. M.M.," she called, and was gone among the rose trees. She looked at her wrist watch, and the windows of the house. It struck her as curiously uninhabited. Past 6! The pigeons were just gathering to roost, and sunlight slanted on the dovecot, on their snowy feathers, and beyond, in a shower, on the top boughs of the woods. The click of billiard balls came from the ingle-nook. Jack Cardigan, no doubt. A faint rustling, too, from a eucalyptus tree, startling Southerner in this old English garden. She reached the veranda, and was passing in, but stopped at the sound of voices from the drawing-room to her left. Mother! Monsieur Profond! From behind the veranda screen which fenced the ingle-nook she heard these words: "I don't, Annette." Did father know that he called her mother Annette? Always on the side of her father, as children are ever on one side or the other in houses where relations are a little strained, she stood uncertain. Her mother was speaking in her low, pleasing, slightly metallic voice. One word she caught: "Demain," and Profond's answer: "All right." Fleur frowned. A little sound came out into the stillness. Then Profond's voice: "I'm taking a small stroll." Fleur darted through the window into the morning-room. There he came from the drawing-room, crossing the veranda, down the lawn, and the click of billiard balls, which, in listening for other sounds, she had ceased to hear, began again. She shook herself, passed into the hall, and opened the drawing-room door. Her mother was sitting on the sofa between the windows, her knees crossed, her head resting on a cushion, her lips half parted, her eyes half closed. She looked extraordinarily handsome. "Ah, here you are, Fleur. Your father is beginning to fuss." "Where is he?" "In the picture gallery. Go up." "What are you going to do to-morrow, mother?" "To-morrow? I go up to London with your aunt." "I thought you might be. Will you get me a quite plain parasol?" "What colour?" "Green. They're all going back, I suppose." "Yes, all. You will console your father. Kiss me, then." Fleur crossed the room, stooped, received a kiss on her forehead, and went out past the impress of a form on the sofa cushions in the other corner. She ran upstairs. Fleur was by no means the old-fashioned daughter who demands the regulation of her parents' lives in accordance with a standard imposed upon herself. She claimed to regulate her own life, not those of others. Besides, an unerring instinct for what was likely to advantage her own case was already at work. In a disturbed domestic atmosphere the heart she had set on John would have a better chance. None the less was she offended, as a flower by a crisping wind. If that man had really been kissing her mother it was serious, and her father ought to know. Demain. All right. And her mother going up to town. She turned into her bedroom and hung out of the window to cool her face, which had suddenly grown very hot. John must be at the station by now. What did her father know about John? Probably everything, pretty nearly. She changed her dress, so as to look as if she had been in some time, and ran up to the gallery. Soames was standing stubbornly still before his Alfred Stevens, the picture he loved best. He did not turn at the sound of the door, but she knew he had heard, and she knew he was hurt. She came up softly behind him, put her arms round his neck, and poked her face over his shoulder till her cheek lay against his. It was an advance which had never yet failed, but it failed her now, and she augured the worst. "Well," he said stonily, "so you've come." "Is that all?" murmured Fleur, "from a bad parent?" And she rubbed her cheek against his. Soames shook his head so far as that was possible. "Why do you keep me on tenterhooks like this, putting me off and off?" "Darling, it was very harmless." "Harmless? Much you know what's harmless, and what isn't." Fleur dropped her arms. "Well then, dear, suppose you tell me, and be quite frank about it." And she went over to the window seat. Her father had turned from his picture and was staring at his feet. He looked very grey. "He has nice small feet," she thought, catching his eye, at once averted from her. "You're my only comfort," said Soames suddenly, "and you go on like this." Fleur's heart began to beat. "Like what, dear?" Again Soames gave her a look which, but for the affection in it, might have been called furtive. "You know what I told you," he said. "I don't choose to have anything to do with that branch of our family." "Yes, ducky, but I don't know why I shouldn't." Soames turned on his heel. "I'm not going into the reasons," he said. "You ought to trust me, Fleur." The way he spoke those words affected Fleur, but she thought of John, and was silent, tapping her foot against the wainscot. Unconsciously she had assumed a modern attitude, with one leg twisted in and out of the other, with her chin on one bent wrist, her other arm across her chest, and its hand hugging her elbow. There was not a line of her that was not involuted, and yet, in spite of all, she retained a certain grace. "You knew my wishes," Soames went on, "and yet you stayed on there 4 days, and I suppose that boy came with you to-day." Fleur kept her eyes on him. "I don't ask you anything," said Soames. "I make no inquisition where you're concerned." Fleur suddenly stood up, leaning out at the window with her chin on her hands. The sun had sunk behind trees, the pigeons were perched, quite still, on the edge of the dovecote. The click of the billiard balls mounted, and a faint radiance shone out below where Jack Cardigan had turned the light up. "Will it make you any happier," she said suddenly, "if I promise you not to see him for, say, the next 6 weeks?" She was not prepared for a sort of tremble in the blankness of his voice. 6 weeks? 6 years? 60 years, more like. Don't delude yourself, Fleur. Don't delude yourself." Fleur turned in alarm. "Father, what is it?" Soames came close enough to see her face. "Don't tell me," he said, "that you're foolish enough to have any feeling beyond caprice. That would be too much." And he laughed. Fleur, who had never heard him laugh like that, thought, "Then it is deep. Oh, what is it?" And putting her hand through his arm, she said lightly, "No, of course, caprice. Only I like my caprices, and I don't like yours, dear." "Mine," said Soames bitterly, and turned away. The light outside had chilled, and threw a chalky whiteness on the river. The trees had lost all gaiety of colour. She felt a sudden hunger for John's face, for his hands, and the feel of his lips again on hers. And pressing her arms tight across her breast, she forced out a little light laugh. "Oh la la! What a small fuss, as Profond would say. Father, I don't like that man." She saw him stop, and take something out of his breast pocket. "You don't?" he said. "Why?" "Nothing," murmured Fleur. "Just caprice." "No," said Soames, "not caprice." And he tore what was in his hands across. "You're right. I don't like him either." "Look," said Fleur softly, "there he goes. I hate his shoes. They don't make any noise." Down in the failing light, Prosper Profond moved, his hands in his side pockets, whistling softly in his beard. He stopped and glanced up at the sky as if saying, "I don't think much of that small moon." Fleur drew back. "Isn't he a great cat?" she whispered, and the sharp click of the billiard balls rose, as if Jack Cardigan had capped the cat, the moon, caprice, and tragedy with "In off the red!" Monsieur Profond had resumed his stroll, to a teasing little tune in his beard. What was it? Oh yes, from Rigoletto. "Donna o mobile." Just what he would think. She squeezed her father's arm. "Prowling," she muttered, as he turned the corner of the house. It was past that disillusioned moment which divides the day and night, still and lingering and warm, with hawthorn scent and lilac scent clinging on the riverside air. A blackbird suddenly burst out. John would be in London by now. In the park, perhaps, crossing the Serpentine, thinking of her. A little sound beside her made her turn her eyes. Her father was again tearing the paper in his hands. Fleur saw it was a cheque. "I shan't sell him my Gauguin," he said. "I don't know what your aunt and Imogen see in him." "Or mother." "Your mother," said Soames. "Poor father," she thought. "He never looks happy. Not really happy. I don't want to make him worse, but of course I shall have to, when John comes back. Oh, well, sufficient unto the night." "I'm going to dress," she said. In her room she had a fancy to put on her freak dress. It was of gold tissue, with little trousers of the same, tightly drawn in at the ankles, a page's cape slung from the shoulders, little gold shoes, and a gold-winged Mercury helmet, and all over her were tiny gold bells, especially on the helmet, so that if she shook her head she pealed. When she was dressed she felt quite sick because John could not see her. It even seemed a pity that the sprightly young man Michael Mont would not have a view. But the gong had sounded, and she went down. She made a sensation in the drawing-room. Winifred thought it most amusing. Imogen was enraptured. Jack Cardigan called it stunning, ripping, topping, and corking. Monsieur Profond, smiling with his eyes, said, "That's a nice small dress." Her mother, very handsome in black, sat looking at her and said nothing. It remained for her father to apply the test of common sense. "What did you put on that thing for? You're not going to dance." Fleur spun round, and the bells pealed. "Caprice!" Soames stared at her, and, turning away, gave his arm to Winifred. Jack Cardigan took her mother. Prosper Profond took Imogen. Fleur went in by herself, with her bells jingling. The small moon had soon dropped down, and May nights had fallen soft and warm, enwrapping with its grape-bloom colour and its scents the billion caprices, intrigues, passions, longings, and regrets of men and women. Happy was Jack Cardigan, who snored into Imogen's white shoulder, fit as a flea; or Timothy in his mausoleum, too old for anything but baby's slumber. For so many lay awake or dreamed, teased by the criss-cross of the world. The dew fell and the flowers closed. Cattle grazed on in the river meadows, feeling with their tongues for the grass they could not see, and the sheep on the downs lay quiet as stones. Pheasants in the tall trees of the Pangbourne woods, larks on their grassy nests above the gravel pit at Wansdon, swallows in the eaves at Robin Hill, and the sparrows of Mayfair, all made a dreamless night of it, soothed by the lack of wind. The mayfly filly, hardly accustomed to her new quarters, scraped at her straw a little, and the few night-flitting things—bats, moths, owls— were vigorous in the warm darkness. But the peace of night lay in the brain of all daytime nature, colourless and still. Men and women, alone, riding the hobby-horses of anxiety or love, burned their wavering tapers of dream and thought into the lonely hours. Fleur, leaning out of her window, heard the hall clock's muffled chime of 12, the tiny splash of a fish, the sudden shaking of an aspen's leaves in the puffs of breeze that rose along the river, the distant rumble of a night train, and time and again the sounds which none can put a name to in the darkness, soft, obscure expressions of uncatalogued emotions from man and beast, bird and machine, or maybe from departed Forsytes, Darties, Cardigans, taking night strolls back into a world which had once suited their embodied spirits. But Fleur heeded not these sounds. Her spirit, far from disembodied, fled with swift wing from railway carriage to flowery hedge, straining after John, tenacious of his forbidden image and the sound of his voice, which was taboo. And she crinkled her nose, retrieving from the perfume of the riverside night that moment when his hand slipped between the mayflowers in her cheek. Long she leaned out in her freak dress, keen to burn her wings at life's candle, while the moths brushed her cheeks on their pilgrimage to the lamp on her dressing-table, ignorant that in a Forsyte's house there is no open flame. But at last even she felt sleepy, and forgetting her bells, drew quickly in. Through the open window of his room, alongside Annette's, Soames, wakeful too, heard their thin faint tinkle, as it might be shaken from stars, or the dewdrops falling from a flower, if one could hear such sounds. Caprice, he thought. I can't tell. She's wilful. What shall I do? Fleur. And long into the small night he brooded. End of Part 1, Chapter 12. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Part 2, Chapter 1 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter number 1, Mother and Son. To say that John Forsyte accompanied his mother to Spain unwillingly would scarcely have been adequate. He went as a well-natured dog goes for a walk with its mistress, leaving a choice mutton bone on the lawn. He went looking back at it. Forsytes, deprived of their mutton bones, are wont to sulk. But John had little sulkiness in his composition. He adored his mother, and it was his first travel. Spain had become Italy by his simply saying, "I would rather go to Spain, Mum. You have been to Italy so many times. I would like it new to both of us." The fellow was subtle besides being naive. He never forgot that he was going to shorten the proposed 2 months into 6 weeks, and must therefore show no sign of wishing to do so. For one with so enticing a mutton bone and so fixed an idea, he made a good enough travelling companion, indifferent to where or when he arrived, superior to food, and thoroughly appreciative of a country strange to the most travelled Englishman. Fleur's wisdom in refusing to write to him was profound, for he reached each new place entirely without hope or fever, and could concentrate immediate attention on the donkeys and tumbling bells, the priest, patios, beggars, children, crowing cocks, sombreros, cactus hedges, old high white villages, goats, olive trees, greening plains, singing birds in tiny cages, water cellars, sunsets, melons, mules, great churches, pictures, and swimming grey-brown mountains of a fascinating land. It was already hot, and they enjoyed an absence of their compatriots. John, who so far as he knew had no blood in him which was not English, was often innately unhappy in the presence of his own countrymen. He felt they had no nonsense about them, and took a more practical view of things than himself. He confided to his mother that he must be an unsociable beast. It was jolly to be away from everybody who could talk about the things people did talk about. To which Irene had replied simply, "Yes, John, I know." In this isolation he had unparalleled opportunities of appreciating what few sons can apprehend, the whole-heartedness of a mother's love. Knowledge of something kept from her made him, no doubt, unduly sensitive, and the southern people stimulated his admiration for her type of beauty, which he had been accustomed to hear called Spanish, but which he now perceived to be no such thing. Her beauty was neither English, French, Spanish, nor Italian. It was special. He appreciated, too, as never before, his mother's subtlety of instinct. He could not tell, for instance, whether she had noticed his absorption in that Goya picture, La Vendimia, or whether she knew that he had slipped back there after lunch and again next morning to stand before it full half an hour, a second and third time. It was not Fleur, of course, but like enough to give him heartache, so dear to lovers, remembering her standing at the foot of his bed with her hand held above her head. To keep a postcard reproduction of this picture in his pocket and slip it out to look at became for John one of those bad habits which soon or late disclose themselves to eyes sharpened by love, fear, or jealousy. And his mother's were sharpened by all three. In Granada he was fairly caught, sitting on a sun-warmed stone bench in a little battlemented garden on the Alhambra hill, whence he ought to have been looking at the view. His mother, he had thought, was examining the potted stalks between the polled acacias, when her voice said, "Is that your favourite Goya, John?" He checked too late a movement such as he might have made at school to conceal some surreptitious document, and answered yes. "It certainly is most charming, but I think I prefer the Quitasol. Your father would go crazy about Goya. I don't believe he saw them when he was in Spain in '92. In '92, 9 years before he had been born! What had been the previous existences of his father and his mother? If they had a right to share in his future, surely he had a right to share in their pasts. He looked up at her, but something in her face, a look of life hard-lived, the mysterious impress of emotions, experience, and suffering seemed, with its incalculable depths, its purchased sanctity, to make curiosity impertinent. His mother must have had a wonderfully interesting life. She was so beautiful, and so... but he could not frame what he felt about her. He got up and stood gazing down at the town, at the plain all green with crops, and the ring of mountains glamorous in sinking sunlight. Her life was like the past of this old Moorish city, full, deep, remote. His own life, as yet such a baby of a thing, hopelessly ignorant and innocent. They said that in those mountains to the west, which rose sheer from the blue-green plain as if out of a sea, Phoenicians had dwelt, a dark, strange, secret race above the land. His mother's life was as unknown to him, as secret, as that Phoenician past was to the town down there, whose cocks crowed and whose children played and clamoured so gaily, day in, day out. He felt aggrieved that she should know all about him, and he nothing about her, except that she loved him and his father, and was beautiful. His callow ignorance, he had not even had the advantage of the war, like nearly everybody else, made him small in his own eyes. That night, from the balcony of his bedroom, he gazed down on the roof of the town as if inlaid with honeycomb of jet, ivory, and gold, and long after he lay awake, listening to the cry of the sentry as the hour struck, and forming in his head these lines: "Voice in the night crying, down in the old sleeping Spanish city darkened under her white stars. What says the voice, its clear lingering anguish? Just a watchman telling his dateless tale of safety? Just a roadman flinging to the moon his song? No, this one deprived, whose lover's heart is weeping, just his cry, how long?" The word deprived seemed to him cold and unsatisfactory, but bereaved was too final, and no other word of 2 syllables, short, long, came to him which would enable him to keep "whose lover's heart is weeping." It was past 2 by the time he had finished it, and past 3 before he went to sleep, having said it over to himself at least 24 times. Next day he wrote it out and enclosed it in one of those letters to Fleur which he always finished before he went down, so as to have his mind free and companionable. About noon that same day, on the tiled terrace of their hotel, he felt a sudden dull pain in the back of his head, a queer sensation in the eyes, and sickness. The sun had touched him too affectionately. The next 3 days were passed in semi-darkness and a dulled, aching indifference to all except the feel of ice on his forehead and his mother's smile. She never moved from his room, never relaxed her noiseless vigilance, which seemed to John angelic. But there were moments when he was extremely sorry for himself, and wished terribly that Fleur could see him. Several times he took a poignant imaginary leave of her and of the earth, tears oozing out of his eyes. He even prepared the message he would send to her by his mother, who would regret to her dying day that she had ever sought to separate them. His poor mother! He was not slow, however, in perceiving that he had now his excuse for going home. Toward 6:30 each evening came the gasgasha of bells, a cascade of tumbling chimes, mounting from the city below and falling back chime on chime. After listening to them on the 4th day, he said suddenly: "I'd like to be back in England, Mum. The sun is too hot." "Very well, darling, as soon as you are fit to travel." And at once he felt better and meaner. They had been out 5 weeks when they turned toward home. John's head was restored to its pristine clarity, but he was confined to a hat lined by his mother with many layers of orange and green silk, and he still walked from choice in the shade. As the long struggle of discretion between them drew to its close, he wondered more and more whether she could see his eagerness to get back to that which she had brought him away from. Condemned by Spanish Providence to spend the day in Madrid between their trains, it was but natural to go again to the Prado. John was elaborately casual this time before his Goya girl. Now that he was going back to her, he could afford a lesser scrutiny. It was his mother who lingered before the picture, saying, "The face and the figure of the girl are exquisite." John heard her uneasily. Did she understand? But he felt once more that he was no match for her in self-control and subtlety. She could, in some supersensitive way, of which he had not the secret, feel the pulse of his thoughts. She knew by instinct what he hoped and feared and wished. It made him terribly uncomfortable and guilty, having beyond most boys a conscience. He wished she would be frank with him. He almost hoped for an open struggle. But none came, and steadily, silently they travelled north. Thus did he first learn how much better than men women play a waiting game. In Paris they had again to pause for a day. John was grieved because it lasted two, owing to certain matters in connection with a dressmaker, as if his mother, who looked beautiful in anything, had any need of dresses. The happiest moment of his travel was that when he stepped on the Folkestone boat. Standing by the bulwark rail, with her arm in his, she said, "I'm afraid you haven't enjoyed it much, John, but you have been very sweet to me." John squeezed her arm. "Oh yes, I have enjoyed it awfully, except for my head lately." And now that the end had come, he really had, feeling a sort of glamour over the past weeks, a kind of painful pleasure, such as he had tried to screw into those lines about the voice in the night crying. A feeling such as he had known as a small boy listening avidly to Chopin, yet wanting to cry. And he wondered why it was that he could not say to her quite simply what she had said to him: "You were very sweet to me." Odd. One never could be nice and natural like that. He substituted the words, "I expect we shall be sick." They were, and reached London somewhat attenuated, having been away 6 weeks and 2 days without a single allusion to the subject, which had hardly ever ceased to occupy their minds. End of Part 2, Chapter 1. Recording by Eva Harnick, Pontevedra, Florida. Part 2, Chapter 2 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick, Pontevedra, Florida. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 2. Fathers and Daughters. Deprived of his wife and son by the Spanish adventure, Jolyon found the solitude at Robin Hill intolerable. A philosopher, when he has all that he wants, is different from a philosopher when he has not. Accustomed, however, to the idea, if not to the reality, of resignation, he would perhaps have faced it out, but for his daughter June. He was a lame duck now, and on her conscience. Having achieved momentarily the rescue of an etcher in low circumstances, which she happened to have in hand, she appeared at Robin Hill a fortnight after Irene and John had gone. June was living now in a tiny house with a big studio at Chiswick. A Forsyte of the best period, so far as the lack of responsibility was concerned, she had overcome the difficulty of a reduced income in a manner satisfactory to herself and her father. The rent of the gallery off Cork Street, which he had bought for her, and her increased income tax happening to balance, it had been quite simple. She no longer paid him the rent. The gallery might be expected now at any time, after 18 years of barren usufruct, to pay its way, so that she was sure her father would not feel it. Through this device she still had 1,200 a year, and by reducing what she ate, and in place of 2 Belgians in a poor way, employing 1 Austrian in a poorer, practically the same surplus for the relief of genius. After 3 days at Robin Hill, she carried her father back with her to town. In those 3 days she had stumbled on the secret he had kept for 2 years, and had instantly decided to cure him. She knew, in fact, the very man. He had done wonders with Paul Post, that painter a little in advance of Futurism, and she was impatient when her father, because his eyebrows would go up, and because he heard of neither. Of course, if he hadn't face, he would never get well. It was absurd not to have faith in the man who had healed Paul Post, so that he had only just relapsed from having overworked or overlived himself again. The great thing about this healer was that he relied on nature. He had made a special study of the symptoms of nature. When his patient failed in any natural symptom, he supplied the poison which caused it. And there you were. She was extremely hopeful. Her father had clearly not been living a natural life at Robin Hill, and she intended to provide the symptoms. He was, she felt, out of touch with the times, which was not natural. His heart wanted stimulating. In the little Chiswick house she and the Austrian, a grateful soul, so devoted to June for rescuing her that she was in danger of disease from overwork, stimulated Jolyon in all sorts of ways, preparing him for his cure. But they could not keep his eyebrows down. As for example, when the Austrian woke him at 8 o'clock just as he was going to sleep, or June took the Times away from him because it was unnatural to read that stuff when he ought to be taking an interest in life. He never failed, indeed, to be astonished at her resource, especially in the evenings. For his benefit, as she declared, though he suspected that she also got something out of it, she assembled The Age so far as it was satellite to genius, and with some solemnity it would move up and down the studio before him in the foxtrot, and that more mental form of dancing, the one-step, which so pulled against the music that Jolyon's eyebrows would be almost lost in his hair from wonder at the strain it must impose on the dancer's will-power. Aware that, hung on the line in the Watercolour Society, he was a back number to those with any pretension to be called artist, he would sit in the darkest corner he could find, and wonder about rhythm on which so long ago he had been raised. And when June brought some girl or young man up to him, he would rise humbly to their level so far as that was possible, and think, dear me, this is very dull for them. Having his father's perennial sympathy with youth, he used to get very tired from entering into their points of view. But it was all stimulating, and he never failed in admiration of his daughter's indomitable spirit. Even genius itself attended these gatherings now and then with its nose on one side, and June always introduced it to her father. This, she felt, was exceptionally good for him, for genius was a natural symptom he had never had, fond as she was of him. Certain as a man can be that she was his own daughter, he often wondered whence she got herself, her red-gold hair, now greyed into a special colour, her direct, spirited face, so different from his own rather folded and subtilized countenance, her little lithe figure when he and most of the Forsytes were tall. and he would dwell on the origin of species and debate whether she might be Danish or Celtic. Celtic, he thought, from her pugnacity and her taste in fillets and geebars. It was not too much to say that he preferred her to the age with which she was surrounded, useful though for the greater part it was. She took, however, too much interest in his teeth, for he still had some of those natural symptoms. Her dentist at once found Staphylococcus aureus present in pure culture, which might cause boils, of course, and wanted to take out all the teeth he had and supply him with 2 complete sets of unnatural symptoms. Jolyon's native tenacity was roused, and in the studio that evening he developed his objections. He had never had any balls, and his own teeth would last his time. Of course, June admitted, they would last his time if he didn't have them out. But if he had more teeth he would have a better heart and his time would be longer. His recalcitrance, she said, was a symptom of his whole attitude. He was taking it lying down. He ought to be fighting. When was he going to see the man who had cured Paul Post? Jolyon was very sorry, but the fact was he was not going to see him. June chafed. Pondridge, she said, the healer, was such a fine man, and he had such difficulty in making 2 ends meet and getting his theories recognized. It was just such indifference and prejudice as her father manifested which was keeping him back. It would be so splendid for both of them. "I perceive," said Jolyon, "that you are trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone." "To cure, you mean," cried June. "My dear, it is the same thing." June protested. It was unfair to say that without a trial. Jolyon thought he might not have the chance of saying it after. "Dad," cried June, "you are hopeless." "That," said Jolyon, "is a fact. But I wish to remain hopeless as long as possible. I shall let sleeping dogs lie, my child. They are quiet at present." "That's not giving science a chance," cried June. "You have no idea how devoted Pondridge is. He puts his science before everything." "Just," replied Jolyon, puffing the mild cigarette to which he was reduced, "as Mr. Paul Post puts his art, eh? Art for art's sake, science for the sake of science. I know those enthusiastic egomaniac gentry. They vivisect you without blinking. I am enough of a Forsyte to give them the go-by, June." "Dad," said June, "if you only knew how old-fashioned that sounds. Nobody can afford to be half-hearted nowadays." "I'm afraid," murmured Jolyon with his smile, "that is the only natural symptom with which Mr. Pondridge need not supply me. We are born to be extreme or to be moderate, my dear, though, if you will forgive my saying so, half the people nowadays who believe they are extreme are really very moderate. I am getting on as well as I can expect, and I must leave it at that." June was silent, having experienced in her time the inexorable character of her father's amiable obstinacy so far as his own freedom of action was concerned. How he came to let her know why Irene had taken John to Spain puzzled Jolyon, for he had little confidence in her discretion. After she had brooded on the news, it brought a rather sharp discussion, during which he perceived to the full the fundamental opposition between her active temperament and his wife's passivity. He even gathered that a little soreness still remained from that generation-old struggle between them over the body of Philip Bosinney. in which the passive had so signally triumphed over the active principle. According to June, it was foolish and even cowardly to hide the past from John. Sheer opportunism, she called it, which, Jolyon put in mildly, is the working principle of real life, my dear. "Oh!" cried June, "you don't really defend her for not telling John, Dad. If it were left to you, you would." "I might, but simply because I know he must find out, which will be worse than if we told him." "Then why don't you tell him? It is just sleeping dogs again." "My dear," said Jolyon, "I wouldn't for the world go against Irene's instinct. He is her boy." "Yours too," cried June. "What is a man's instinct compared with a mother's?" "Well, I think it's very weak of you." "I dare say," said Jolyon, "I dare say." And that was all she got from him, but the matter rankled in her brain. She could not bear sleeping dogs, and there stirred in her a tortuous impulse to push the matter towards decision. John ought to be told, so that either his feeling might be nipped in the bud, or, flowering in spite of the past, come to fruition. And she determined to see Fleur and judge for herself. When June determined on anything, delicacy became a somewhat minor consideration. After all, she was Soames's cousin, and they were both interested in pictures. She would go and tell him that he ought to buy a pole post, or perhaps a piece of sculpture by Boris Strumolovsky. And of course she would say nothing to her father. She went on the following Sunday, looking so determined that she had some difficulty in getting a cab at Reading station. The river country was lovely in those days of her own months, and June ached at its loveliness. She who had passed through this life without knowing what union was had a love of natural beauty which was almost madness. And when she came to that choice spot where Soames had pitched his tent, she dismissed her cab because, business over, she wanted to revel in the bright water and the woods. She appeared at his front door, therefore, as a mere pedestrian, and sent in her card. It was in June's character to know that when her nerves were fluttering, she was doing something worthwhile. If one's nerves did not flutter, she was taking the line of least resistance, and knew that nobleness was not obliging her. She was conducted to a drawing-room, which, though not in her style, showed every mark of fastidious elegance. Thinking too much taste, too many knick-knacks, she saw in an old lacquer-framed mirror the figure of a girl coming in from the veranda. Clothed in white and holding some white roses in her hand, she had, reflected in that silvery grey pool of glass, a vision-like appearance, as if a pretty ghost had come out of the green garden. "How do you do?" said June, turning round. "I am a cousin of your father's." "Oh yes, I saw you in that confectioner's." "With my young step-brother." "Is your father in?" "He will be directly. He has only gone for a little walk." June slightly narrowed her blue eyes and lifted her decided chin. "Your name is Fleur, isn't it? I have heard of you from Holly. What do you think of John?" The girl lifted the roses in her hand, looked at them, and answered calmly: "He's quite a nice boy." "Not a bit like Holly or me, is he?" "Not a bit." "She is cool," thought June. And suddenly the girl said: "I wish you would tell me why our families don't get on." Confronted with the question she had advised her father to answer, June was silent. Whether because this girl was trying to get something out of her, or simply because what one would do theoretically is not always what one will do when it comes to the point. "You know," said the girl, "the surest way to make people find out the worst is to keep them ignorant. My father has told me it was a quarrel about property, but I don't believe it. We have both got heaps. They wouldn't have been so bourgeois as all that." June flushed. The word applied to her grandfather and her father offended her. "My grandfather," she said, "was very generous, and my father is too. Neither of them was in the least bourgeois." "Well, what was it then?" repeated the girl, conscious that this young Forsyte meant having what she wanted. June at once determined to prevent her, and to get something for herself instead. "Why do you want to know?" The girl smelled at her roses. "I only want to know because they won't tell me." "Well, it was about property, but there is more than one kind." "That makes it worse. Now I really must know." June's small and resolute face quivered. She was wearing a round cap, and her hair had fluffed out under it. She looked quite young at that moment, rejuvenated by encounter. "You know," she said, "I saw you drop your handkerchief. Is there anything between you and John? Because if so, you had better drop that too." The girl grew paler, but she smiled. "If there were, that isn't the way to make me." At the gallantry of that reply, June held out her hand. "I like you, but I don't like your father. I never have. We may as well be frank." "Did you come down to tell him that?" June laughed. "No, I came down to see you." "How delightful of you!" This girl could fence. "I am 2.5 times your age," said June, "but I quite sympathize. It is horrid not to have one's own way." The girl smiled again. "I really think you might tell me." How the child stuck to her point! "It is not my secret, but I will see what I can do, because I think both you and John ought to be told. And now I will say good-bye. Won't you wait and see Father?" June shook her head. "How can I get over to the other side? I will row you across." "Look," said June impulsively, "next time you are in London, come and see me. This is where I live. I generally have young people in the evening, but I should not tell your father that you are coming." The girl nodded. Watching her scull the skiff across, June thought, "She's awfully pretty and well made." "I never thought Soames would have a daughter as pretty as this. She and John would make a lovely couple." The instinct to couple, starved within herself, was always at work in June. She stood watching Fleur row back. The girl took her hand off a scull to wave farewell, and June walked languidly on between the meadows and the river with an ache in her heart. Youth to youth, like the dragonflies chasing each other, and love like the sun warming them through and through. Her youth, so long ago, when Phil and she. And since, nothing. No one had been quite what she had wanted. And so she had missed it all. But what a coil was round those two young things, if they really were in love, as Holly would have it, as her father and Irene and Soames himself seemed to dread. What a coil, and what a barrier! And the itch for the future, the contempt, as it were, for what was overpast, which forms the active principle, moved in the heart of one who ever believed that what one wanted was more important than what other people did not want. From the bank awhile, in the warm summer stillness, she watched the water-lily plants and willow leaves, the fishes rising, sniffed the scent of grass and meadow-sweet, wondering how she could force everybody to be happy. John and Fleur, two little lame ducks, charming, callow, yellow little ducks. A great pity. Surely something could be done. One must not take such situations lying down. She walked on and reached the station, hot and cross. That evening, faithful to the impulse toward direct action which made many people avoid her, she said to her father: "Dad, I have been down to see young Fleur. I think she's very attractive. It is no good hiding our heads under our wings, is it?" The startled Jolyon set down his barley water and began crumbling his bread. "It is what you appear to be doing," he said. "Do you realize whose daughter she is? Can't the dead past bury its dead?" Jolyon rose. "Certain things can never be buried." "I disagree," said June. "It is that which stands in the way of all happiness and progress. You don't understand the age, Dad. It's got no use for outgrown things. Why do you think it matters so terribly that John should know about his mother? Who pays any attention to that sort of thing now? The marriage laws are just as they were when Soames and Irene couldn't get a divorce, and you had to come in. We have moved, and they haven't, so nobody cares. Marriage without a decent chance of relief is only a sort of slave-owning. People ought not to own each other. Everybody sees that now. If Irene broke such laws, what does it matter?" "It is not for me to disagree there," said Jolyon, "but that is all quite beside the mark. This is a matter of human feeling." "Of course it is," cried June, "the human feeling of those two young things." "My dear," said Jolyon with gentle exasperation, "you are talking nonsense." "I am not. If they prove to be really fond of each other, why should they be made unhappy because of the past?" "You have not lived that past. I have, through the feelings of my wife, through my own nerves and my imagination, as only one who is devoted can." June too rose and began to wander restlessly. "If," she said suddenly, "she were the daughter of Philip Bosinney, I could understand you better. Irene loved him, she never loved Soames." Jolyon uttered a deep sound, the sort of noise an Italian peasant woman utters to her mule. His heart had begun beating furiously, but he paid no attention to it, quite carried away by his feelings. "That shows how little you understand. Neither I nor John, if I know him, would mind a love past. It is the brutality of a union without love. This girl is the daughter of the man who once owned John's mother as a negro slave was owned. You can't lay that ghost. Don't try to, June. It is asking us to see John joined to the flesh and blood of the man who possessed John's mother against her will. It is no good mincing words. I want it clear once for all. And now I mustn't talk any more, or I shall have to sit up with this all night." And putting his hand over his heart, Jolyon turned his back on his daughter, and stood looking at the river Thames. June, who by nature never saw a hornet's nest until she had put her head into it, was seriously alarmed. She came and slipped her arms through his, not convinced that he was right, and she herself wrong, because that was not natural to her. She was yet profoundly impressed by the obvious fact that the subject was very bad for him. She rubbed her cheek against his shoulder and said nothing. After taking her elderly cousin across, Fleur did not land at once, but pulled in among the reeds into the sunshine. The peaceful beauty of the afternoon seduced for a little one not much given to the vague and poetic. In the field beyond the bank where her skiff lay up, a machine drawn by a grey horse was turning an early field of hay. She watched the grass cascading over and behind the light wheels with fascination. It looked so cool and fresh. The click and swish blended with the rustle of the willows and the poplars, and the cooing of a wood pigeon in a true river song. Alongside, in the deep green water, weeds like yellow snakes were writhing and nosing with the current. Pied cattle on the farther side stood in the shade, lazily swishing their tails. It was an afternoon to dream. And she took out John's letters, not flowery effusions, but haunted in their recital of things seen and done by a longing very agreeable to her, and all ending "Your devoted J." Fleur was not sentimental. Her desires were ever concrete and concentrated. But what poetry there was in the daughter of Soames and Annette had certainly in those weeks of waiting gathered round her memories of John. They all belonged to grass and blossom, flowers and running water. She enjoyed him in the sense absorbed by her crinkling nose. The stars could persuade her that she was standing beside him in the centre of the map of Spain, and of an early morning the dewy cobwebs, the hazy sparkle and promise of the day down in the garden, were John personified to her. 2 white swans came majestically by while she was reading his letters, followed by their brood of 6 young swans in a line, with just so much water between each tail and head, a flotilla of grey destroyers. Fleur thrust her letters back, got out her sculls, and pulled up to the landing stage. Crossing the lawn, she wondered whether she should tell her father of June's visit. If he learned of it from the butler, he might think it odd if she did not. It gave her, too, another chance to startle out of him the reason of the feud. She went, therefore, up the road to meet him. Soames had gone to look at a patch of ground on which the local authorities were proposing to erect a sanatorium for people with weak lungs. Faithful to his native individualism, he took no part in local affairs, content to pay the rates which were always going up. He could not, however, remain indifferent to this new and dangerous scheme. The site was not half a mile from his own house. He was quite of opinion that the country should stamp out tuberculosis, but this was not the place. It should be done farther away. He took indeed an attitude common to all true Forsytes, that disability of any sort in other people was not his affair, and the state should do its business without prejudicing in any way the natural advantages which he had acquired or inherited. Francie, the most free-spirited Forsyte of his generation, except perhaps that fellow Jolyon, had once asked him in her malicious way, "Did you ever see the name Forsyte in a subscription list, Soames?" That was as it might be, but a sanatorium would depreciate the neighbourhood, and he should certainly sign the petition which was being got up against it. Returning with this decision fresh within him, he saw Fleur coming. She was showing him more affection of late, and the quiet time down here with her in this summer weather had been making him feel quite young. Annette was always running up to town for one thing or another, so that he had Fleur to himself almost as much as he could wish. To be sure, young Mont had formed the habit of appearing on his motorcycle almost every other day. Thank goodness the young fellow had shaved off his half-truth bushes and no longer looked like a mountebank. With a girl-friend of Fleur's, who was staying in the house, and the neighbouring youths also, they made two couples after dinner in the hall to the music of the electric pianola, which performed foxtrots unassisted, with a surprised shine on its expressive surface. Annette even now and then passed gracefully up and down in the arms of one or other of the young men. And Soames, coming to the drawing-room door, would lift his nose a little sideways and watch them, waiting to catch a smile from Fleur, then move back to his chair by the drawing-room hearth to peruse the Times or some other collector's price list. To his ever-anxious eyes, Fleur showed no sign of remembering that caprice of hers. When she reached him on the dusty road, he slipped his hand within her arm. "Who do you think has been to see you, Dad?" She couldn't wait. "Guess." "I never guess," said Soames uneasily. "Who?" "Your cousin June Forsyte." Quite unconsciously, Soames gripped her arm. What did she want? "I don't know. But it was rather breaking through the feud, wasn't it?" "Feud? What feud?" "The one that exists in your imagination, dear." Soames dropped her arm. Was she mocking or trying to draw him on? "I suppose she wanted me to buy a picture," he said at last. "I don't think so. Perhaps it was just family affection." "She's only a first cousin once removed," muttered Soames. "And the daughter of your enemy." "What do you mean by that?" "I beg your pardon, dear. I thought he was." "Enemy," repeated Soames. "It is ancient history. I don't know where you get your notions." "From June Forsyte." It had come to her as an inspiration that if he thought she knew or were on the edge of knowledge, he would tell her. Soames was startled, but she had underrated his caution and tenacity. "If you know," he said coldly, "why do you plague me?" Fleur saw that she had overreached herself. "I don't want to plague you, darling. As you say, why want to know more? Why want to know anything of that small mystery? Je m'en fiche, as Profond says." "That chap," said Soames profoundly. That chap, indeed, played a considerable, if invisible part of this summer, for he had not turned up again. Ever since the Sunday when Fleur had drawn attention to him prowling on the lawn, Soames had thought of him a good deal, and always in connection with Annette, for no reason, except that she was looking handsomer than for some time past. His possessive instinct, subtle, less formal, more elastic since the war, kept all misgivings underground. As one looks on some American river, quiet and pleasant, knowing that an alligator perhaps is lying in the mud, with his snout just raised and indistinguishable from a snag of wood, so Soames looked on the river of his own existence, subconscious of Monsieur Profond, refusing to see more than the suspicion of his snout. He had, at this epoch in his life, practically all he wanted, and was as nearly happy as his nature would permit. His senses were at rest. His affections found all the vent they needed in his daughter. His collection was well known, his money well invested, his health excellent, save for a touch of liver now and again. He had not yet begun to worry seriously about what would happen after death, inclining to think that nothing would happen. He resembled one of his own gilt-edged securities, and to knock the gilt off by seeing anything he could avoid seeing would be, he felt, instinctively perverse and retrogressive. Those two crumpled rose leaves, Fleur's caprice and Monsieur Profond's snout, would level away if he lay on them industriously. That evening, chance, which visits the life of even the best invested Forsytes, put a clue into Fleur's hands. Her father came down to dinner without a handkerchief, and had occasion to blow his nose. "I will get you one, dear," she had said, and ran upstairs. In the sachet where she sought for it, an old sachet of very faded silk, there were two compartments. One held handkerchiefs, the other was buttoned and contained something flat and hard. By some childish impulse Fleur unbuttoned it. There was a frame, and in it a photograph of herself as a little girl. She gazed at it fascinated, as one is by one's own presentment. It slipped under her fidgeting thumb, and she saw that another photograph was behind. She pressed her own down farther, and perceived a face which she seemed to know, of a young woman, very good-looking, in a very old style of evening dress. Slipping her own photograph up over it again, she took out a handkerchief and went down. Only on the stairs did she identify that face. Surely, surely, John's mother! The conviction came as a shock, and she stood still in a flurry of thought. Why, of course, John's father had married the woman her father had wanted to marry, had cheated him out of her, perhaps. Then, afraid of showing by her manner that she had lighted on his secret, she refused to think further, and shaking out the silk handkerchief, entered the dining-room. "I chose the softest, father." Said Soames. "I only use those after a cold. Never mind." That evening passed for Fleur in putting two and two together, recalling the look on her father's face in the confectioner's shop a look strange and coldly intimate, a queer look. He must have loved that woman very much to have kept her photograph all this time in spite of having lost her. Unsparing and matter-of-fact, her mind darted to his relations with her own mother. Had he ever really loved her? She thought not. John was the son of the woman he had really loved. Surely, then, he ought not to mind his daughter loving him. It only wanted getting used to. And a sigh of sheer relief was caught in the folds of her nightgown slipping over her head. End of Part 2, Chapter 2, Fathers and Daughters. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.